Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is Mr. Huffman. As always, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're watching this. Today, we're going to kind of be ending the unit already, this forging an American identity. And before we move on to kind of the Great Divide, Unit 5 coming up the week after this. But where we're going to leave off here is really going to begin the abolitionist movement. And there had been some of our founding fathers going back as early as the 1770s, 1780s, who expressed, a distrust or an uncomfortability, a moral obligation to maybe limit slavery. But the full-blown abolitionist movement isn't really going to come around until the 1820s, 1830s, where more and more people, certainly some black activists, but more importantly, in some ways, white activists who are going to be the ones who are really going to change the dynamic to stand up and say, hey, slavery is a morally repugnant and, destructive moral act that we need to get rid of. That's going to start to happen. And again, I want to stress this, and I'll say this several times. This really never reaches a majority opinion. Okay, as high as maybe 40 to 45% of perhaps Northerners were going to come to feel this way. But overall, this is never going to be the majority opinion. But this is a great example in American history, and you see this several times, of a group that is not necessarily the majority opinion, in some cases, and oftentimes the minority opinion, who still finds a way and uses mechanisms at their disposal to make some long-lasting changes. And that's always an important lesson to remember. So again, getting into some of this early opposition to slavery, again, a lot of the founders, even some who were slave owners themselves, saw through and understood that, wait a minute, this whole concept of slavery really contradicts a lot of principles regarding liberty and equality. Okay, so a lot of them kind of see through this and understand, well, this isn't necessarily the way we should go. Again, even sometimes slave owners themselves saw this. And in particular, some religious groups are going to speak out against slavery, such as the Quakers or Baptists. I would say quite justifiably, they call out slavery for what it is, a sin of the highest order, that this is wrong, this is morally unjust, this is not something God looks on humanity, especially America, in some sort of a favorable light. But when it comes to actually possibly getting rid of slavery, you're going to see a wide variety of opinions. The kind of one of those earliest ones that some of the founders themselves held is going to be one of gradualism, that we can't just end slavery overnight. We can't just flip a switch and all of a sudden all the African Americans in the South are free. That's what they claimed. I think we could have done that, but whatever. Instead, they saw, and I understood why they thought this, that we need to approach this over time. We need to kind of gradually get rid of this as a concept, okay? Because then possibly there's an approach where we can start to wean our whole cultures off of it. So this is the kind of belief by early abolitionists that we can't just get rid of slavery overnight. We need to kind of do it at a slow process, okay? And what does all that entail? Well, for one thing, we need to stop kind of the importation of new slaves, okay? Phase out slavery at first in the North. That's an easier place to get rid of it because North is much less reliant on slavery. And then start to transition to the upper South parts where they don't have as much slavery, even though they have some. And then eventually kind of really tackle it in the heart of the South, in cotton country. So that was the goal by these gradualists. We ended in the North, take it on in kind of the upper South before moving into the kind of more concentrated problematic areas where slavery is so much a fabric of the social, cultural, political, economic framework. And the idea of these gradualists was that, well, if these slave owners need to make up their money somehow, so why don't we compensate them for their loss? Why don't we kind of pay them some money to compensate for the fact that they own another human being, which would allow that part of the country theoretically to start investing more and more in an industrialized economy that does not need slavery to exist. Okay, so I would say this is a good start of sorts, but it's still really not looking dead center and dead square at what slavery is, and that there are people who are not, generations of people who are not going to live to see this, right? That they want freedom now. They don't want something to happen 10, 20, 30 years from now. There's no guarantee they're going to be alive to see that day, right? And so as good as a start this gradualism is, it's not going nearly quick enough. Okay. And another possibility is that of colonization. Okay. The idea that, well, maybe we could actually start a colony for former slaves and send them there. Okay. And there's actually going to be some pretty prominent members of American society that are really going to kind of subscribe to this notion. James Madison, president; James Monroe, president; Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, both influential Congress members, and then even the Chief Justice John Marshall are all going to buy into this notion that, hey, let's start a colony somewhere and kind of send some former slaves there. Okay. And this came at a time where some land was actually acquired in West Africa by the U.S. government, which meant this could be a possibility that we could actually ship them back, and maybe that could happen. Okay. And so some free African Americans are going to board such a ship, set sail for land that would soon actually become the sovereign nation of Liberia. Okay, so Liberia is going to be a nation that we almost kind of helped create. In some ways, Liberia is a spinoff, if you want to think of it that way, of the U.S. Like, if you have Riverdale, then you got Sabrina the Teenage Witch. It's a spinoff of sorts from that. Okay, it kind of comes from that. And so the idea, too, is that they actually adopt a constitution based on that of the U.S. And even their capital city this very day, Monrovia, is named after President James Monroe, who kind of was the one who oversaw this and had kind of pushed this notion into reality. Okay. And so Liberia as a sovereign nation is going to be created. But the thing is, it's not going to be economically or technologically feasible to actually transport all of these former slaves to a new nation, right? And so that is, we do help create Liberia, but we're not going to get nowhere near the amount of slaves sent there, right? The transportation cost would be enormous for that, totally unfeasible. And the honest truth is, many free African Americans, some of which had endured the horrors of slavery, would much rather live in the U.S., even if it's in the North, far from their home of sorts, in the South. They still love America, which is, I would say, an incredible testament to their own faith in our country, that they would be willing to love America after what America had done to them, right? But nonetheless, they're going to say, listen, we like it here in America. If as bad as it is, we don't really want to have to move all the way over there. Okay, so only about 12,000 are going to make that move to Liberia. And Liberia is going to kind of have its own sustainable population over the years and grow as a nation. But really, only 12,000 slaves or former slaves, or even some free African Americans, make that journey to Liberia between those years of kind of the late 1840s to 1860s. So this whole idea of colonization, kind of something of an idea, but not quite feasible, right? And I should say, some of these guys who did come up with this idea or subscribe to this idea, in its own way, sometimes was a product of racism, okay? Because they just didn't want African Americans living here. So it's not purely, oh, we want to create a land for them. Some of them actually just wanted them out of the nation, who they didn't think the nation was built or made for them. So as benevolent as this may sound, in some ways, it's due to their own racism as well. This here's kind of just a map to show you that territory of Liberia, which, again, some free African Americans or former slaves are going to go to. So as the decades are moving on, there's going to be more and more people who are justifiably like, no, we need abolition not yesterday, not 50 years from now. We need it right now. Okay. And in particular, abolition is calling for enslaved African Americans to be freed immediately without gradual compensation to former slaveholders. They're saying, no, these slave owners, they don't deserve any kind of money for subscribing and participating in such an immoral act. And so they're saying, no, why should they get anything? If anything, we should be giving these former slaves money and kind of a way to start their own lives. Why should these slave owners be getting any money? Okay. And as we're going through the 1820s, getting into the 1830s, abolition is going to start to gain more and more traction. As I said in the past, in large part, kind of inspired by that Second Great Awakening. So the Second Great Awakening is, again, it's moving the women's movement, it's moving prison reform, it's moving education. It's having a lot of positive effects overall, and abolition and kind of combating slavery is going to be another one of those major positive effects, because slavery is going to be identified quite correctly by some of these abolitionists as an enormous sin for which the nation needs to repent. If the nation is not willing to repent from this, then America is a fundamentally sinful, immoral place, is what these abolitionists are beating the drum about. And this guy in particular is going to be pretty important. He's going to be William Lloyd Garrison. He's going to found a very influential abolitionist anti-slavery newspaper known as The Liberator, and he's going to see slavery and slave owners as what they are, inherently evil. And he himself is going to found the American Anti-Slavery Society. And he himself was frustrated by all these gradual approaches and is advocating for a much more immediate, harsh response. Okay. And he sees that kind of concept of colonization, as I said, as racist, as paternalistic, as, well, you're trying to help African Americans, but what you're really saying is, we don't want you here, get out of here. And he's like, no, that they should be as participatory in the American dream as any white person here is. Okay. And in particular, he attacks the Constitution as saying, hey, we hold it up as this great document, yet it failed to ban slavery. All those conversations, remember we talked about that they were being had or not being had in the 1780s. He's saying the fact that the Constitution did not ban slavery is wrong and is evil, and that we need to kind of push for constitutional amendments that do ban slavery. There are going to be some other white abolitionists as well. I'm going to kind of speed through them because William Lloyd Garrison was the biggest one, but there are going to be some others. A guy by the name of Theodore Weld. He himself was a disciple of that theologian and minister I mentioned in the past, Charles Grandison Finney, and he's going to recruit and train many abolitionists for American Anti-Slavery Society. There's going to be two brothers, Arthur and Lewis Tappan. They're very two devout and wealthy New York City brothers who helped finance a lot of this abolitionist movement. Prudence Crandall is also, and Lucia Mott is also going to be some other ones. And also Sarah and Angelica Grimke's sisters also, who are Southerners who moved to the North to work on a lot of anti-slavery stuff. And the next slide, I'm going to talk about two of the most prominent black abolitionists, and we should really mention and really honor them. But it also is important that it's one thing for African Americans to naturally see slavery as this immoral act that needs to be expunged from the nation's history and from the nation's moral fiber. But it takes on a whole new dimension when white people themselves are starting to say this. Because if only black people are saying this, it's not frankly going to go anywhere because they're still a minority. But when the majority are not the majority of everyone, but the majority demographic of white people are starting to step up and say, no, we need to get rid of this. That's when more and more people's minds, white people who maybe wouldn't listen to some of the black abolitionists I'm going to mention, they're hearing other white people say this. That's going to slowly start to get the ball rolling and slowly start to change some minds. But the two really most important abolitionists of African American descent, I've already mentioned some to an extent, are coming up here. And this is important, again, that these African American abolitionists are playing a prominent role in this movement, okay, that a lot of William Lloyd Garrisons understand that we need to kind of have very successful black people have leadership roles in this if this has any chance of convincing white and black America that this is something that could actually happen. And this really fuels the sails of the Liberator, who are actively taking part in a lot of these protests and demonstrations. I've talked about him a little bit in class, but just to give you the official rundown of him here, Frederick Douglass. He is really not just the most prominent activist of this era, he is the most prominent African-American of this era, bar none, okay? I've also said this in the past, but it's true. He's really, I would say, notable as being the first black celebrity, the first black American public thinker in a significant way, okay? Because he is going to start to be one of the first black people that average white person who didn't really know maybe a black person personally are going to start pointing at and saying, oh, I know him. I recognize that name. I've maybe even read something that he's written, which for a lot of white people was astounding that an African-American could read or write and that they would actually express themselves through those means. He's going to be a former slave himself who in 1838 escapes from Maryland by posing as a free sailor. And he publishes his own anti-slavery newspaper separate from the Liberator, known as the North Star, and writes a really great autobiography I'd highly recommend you read. You've already read a section of it, if you have, on the Slavery Primary Sources excerpt I had, called Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. And this is a huge hit and really puts his name on the map, but also the notion that an African-American can escape slavery and go on to do great things. He isn't going to just take some kind of piddly northern job that really doesn't want him. He's going to make his own success. He's going to make his own celebrity. Okay. Another improminent one, there was a woman, and that's also very notable at this time, Sojourner Truth. She gains her own freedom in 1827 and is really going to work hard in trying to free all remaining enslaved people. Now, the truth of the matter is she didn't have a lot of education, but that didn't really stop her from expressing herself and her wit and her humor and her vast intelligence in her own way that was not nearly quite as educated as Frederick Douglass, but is going to have a massive impact. And in particular, in the 1840s, she's going to deliver a series of anti-slavery speeches, which are really beautiful stuff to read. Go back and read. I would highly recommend that. They're eloquent, they're joyous, and they really are deeply religious in the sense that they're pointing out slavery as this moral abhorrence, but not one that America cannot be forgiven from. Okay, it's one that America can be forgiven from and can move on and can be redeemed if she so chooses to do so, and she, in that case, being America, that are going to draw large crowds. Not just black people in the North, but even white people are starting to come to this and say, this is maybe something to think about. So between Douglass and Sojourner Truth, more and more African-American activists are starting to step up and starting to be brave when it comes to speaking out against slavery at that time period. So what are going to be some of these responses to abolition in the South? As you can imagine, not very good, because slavery is, as I've said over and over again, with cotton country, essential to Southern life. If they just flipped the switch and got rid of slavery and all those slaves were free and not working in the fields, that would just collapse the Southern economy. Okay, because again, they didn't have that manufacturing base of the North. They didn't have all those mills that the North had, and cotton is still king. Okay. And the South Carolina governor even goes as far as to claim that, hey, slavery is providing a national benefit. In his own way, he's actually kind of right about that, right? Because as abhorrent and as we should point fingers at the South for this, the North is benefiting in their own ways from slavery for getting cotton and other goods cheap, as well as Western Europe. So he's saying, listen, this is providing a national benefit. Are you really sure you want to get rid of this? Are you willing to pay the economic price? And Thomas Dew, who was a Southern academic at this time, and many others are going to just shrug and kind of write these justifications to say, no, slaves are happy. Slaves love the status quo. Why would they want to, be broken away from that, which are categorically usually false, okay? And in the South, there's going to be a severe crackdown against the Liberator, which never actually really seriously circulated throughout the South, and other general abolitionist literature after Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. So after that happens, the Southern whites are, makes sense, really scared about more and more of these abolitionist ideas getting out. And so they're going to really crack down, and there's going to be kind of, people trying to mail the Liberator to the South to get more white people and in some cases ministers to get involved. And a lot of, people who are subscribing to slavery and want slavery to continue, which is the majority of white Southerners, they're just kind of gathering all these up and in some cases have kind of these very public burnings of the Liberator. And in 1836, the House of Representatives, which is under Southern pressure at the time, is going to pass a gag rule that kind of immediately tables all abolitionist petitions and measures, because there's a large movement to try to get measures introduced in Congress that bring this up. But under Southern pressures, the House of Representatives is going to basically say, no, we're just taking this off the table. We're not going to acknowledge this in any kind of meaningful, serious way. So as you can imagine, the South is very much scared by all this. The status quo as it existed in the 1830s, 1840s really was relying on slavery. They don't want anything to upset that apple cart, because if it does, again, the Southern economy is going to effectively collapse. So what is responses to abolition in the North? You might think they're much more positive, but in their own ways, they're going to face some roadblocks as well, because it's tricky when talking about the North at this time period, because there's some stereotypes and cliches that need debunking. In the North, generally, average white person would be opposed to slavery, but they also feared a nation and hated abolition in large numbers as well, because they feared the idea or the notion that what happens if we free African Americans? What role are they going to play in society? Are they going to take our jobs? Are they going to take our freedom? Are they going to get the vote? That was a big fear, even by some white Northerners who didn't really like slavery, but were still scared about what the reality would be, which I would say in their own way, they're subscribing to white supremacy with that. And again, they said, listen, if we get rid of slavery, this threatens to uproot the existing social system, and it could lead to a war between the states, which is going to happen, right? And also the idea that, well, these free African Americans, they could overwhelm the labor market. They could work for less and put white people out of work. They could be getting homes that white people want to get. So that's just going to be a reality of what this possible future could look like without slavery, right? And Garrison and many other prominent members of this community, white and black alike, are going to be threatened and in some cases outright assaulted, okay? And even Northerners kind of resent Southern slave catchers who sometimes would come up to the North and say, we're looking for this slave. They escaped some years ago or some months ago, and we're looking for them, trying to find them. And despite all this kind of negativity Northerners sometimes felt towards the abolition movement, they really didn't like Southerners coming up there and trying to capture former slaves. And then so in some cases, they're actually going to pass laws restricting runaway or slave catchers from kind of kidnapping and taking away these runaway slaves. But again, as I said, I want to stress this overall abolition movement, while it's gaining power, while it's gaining some influence, is still a minority, and is really, even at its height, only going to get to maybe anywhere between 35 to 45% of the white and northern population is really on board with it. But the biggest thing it is doing is that it's going to start convincing people in power, hey, this is something that we need to pay attention to, and it's something we maybe need to listen to, okay? And also, it's making, more and more Northerners aware of that in general, the average person who maybe didn't think a lot about slavery, but they're reading Frederick Douglass's writings, they're hearing William Lloyd Garrison, what he's saying about slavery, and it's going to start to get more and more traction. And more than anything, it's going to start to divide the nation. Even in the North, it's going to start to be divisive about, should we have slavery, should we not? And in the South, they want to keep it mostly status quo, and anyone who really speaks out against slavery in the South is really especially going to be discriminated against or prejudices thrown their way. But there is some hope. There is some changes being made that in the end are going to culminate in some much larger changes. So this is Mr. Huffman signing off. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Take care.